My once doting and loving husband now ignores our daughter and snapped that life would be easier without her. I'm devastated, and don't know what to do. I'm posting this on a throwaway account because my husband knows my main account and I feel bad about bringing our problems to the internet, but I don't have anyone else I can turn to about this without risking things getting worse. I don't even know where to start with this. For some context, my husband, 38M, and I, 42F, have been together for nearly 16 years and married for 10. We met while he was passing through the city I lived in at the time for work-related reasons. After keeping in touch over the phone for a long while, and after multiple hints and signs from me, he confessed his love for me, and we've been together ever since. He moved in with me after 3 years and settled in well. My family loves him, and he managed to land a good job as a high school history teacher at nearby school. Throughout our entire relationship, he has been very loving and nurturing, always taking my feelings into consideration and going out of his way to keep us both happy. He is incredibly sweet, and even after 16 years, my love for him hasn't faltered at all. With that being said, it's a big reason why his recent behavior has completely blindsided me, and I have no idea what to do. We had our first child, who I'll call Dawn for now, almost 5 years ago. My pregnancy was incredibly smooth and easygoing, and all throughout, my husband was even more gentle and loving toward me. It made me feel incredibly lucky to be starting a family with him. There were some complications during the birth, but overall, it was a wonderful experience, and we were overjoyed to finally have our daughter. For the first month or so, my husband was adamant that I let him do all the heavy lifting so I could focus solely on myself and Dawn. During this time, he took care of nearly all the house chores, with my parents and sister often stopping by to help with Dawn and other tasks, and made sure to spend time with Dawn whenever I needed a break. Once we both returned to work, he called my parents during his lunch break to check in. During Dawn's later infancy and early baby years, he eased up a bit on his checking in, but by no means did he give her less attention. Over time, though, I noticed that he was gradually spending less and less time with Dawn and seemed to be focusing more on work. I love Dawn with all my heart and am incredibly grateful she is in our lives, but I'd be lying if I said she was an easy child. She is very stubborn and lively for her age, so when my husband and I aren't scrambling to make sure she doesn't hurt herself or get into mischief, we're busy calming her down from tantrums. It can be exhausting. What's more concerning is how much this seems to be wearing on my husband. Nowadays, he's less motivated and energetic than he used to be. He's still sweet to me, but he's starting to pull away from me and Dawn. Our life in the bedroom has become completely non-existent. The most upsetting thing I've noticed recently, though, is how distant he's become with Dawn. The other day, during breakfast, she was excitedly trying to tell him about a show she'd been watching. He just put his cereal in the fridge and walked away. The look on Dawn's face when she asked me why he was ignoring her completely broke my heart. Another issue is how little he's doing to help with Dawn. Every morning, I wake up early to get her dressed and fed for the day, drive her to school, and pick her up later. I take her to every doctor appointment, dentist visit, playdate, and school event. It feels like the only time my husband spends with Dawn is after she gets home from school and when he makes dinner. This has led to many arguments where I ask him why he doesn't put more effort into his relationship with Dawn. He always gets defensive and never gives me a clear answer. What prompted me to post here was an argument we had earlier this week. I was about to take Dawn to the babysitter since no one would be home to care for her. I honestly can't remember how it started, but it quickly escalated. Many hurtful words were exchanged, and I'll admit that some of the things I said were out of line. He started ranting about how much he's done for our family and how hard this is for him. I interrupted, asking how it could be so hard for him when I'm the one doing everything related to Dawn. He snapped, saying that if it weren't for her, things wouldn't be this hard. After he said that, we both went quiet. I probably would have torn into him, but I was too shocked. He suddenly decided he needed to go for a walk to clear his head. I've been completely shaken since that argument. I thought he was happy and just going through a rough time. After that comment, though, I've been rethinking every aspect of our relationship since Dawn was born. I feel heartbroken and numb. I don't know where to go from here. My husband and I have hardly spoken since the fight, and honestly, I don't even know what I'd say. At this point, I'm drained. I love him very much, but if he doesn't start getting his act together, I'm not sure I can handle this much longer. What can I do? I can't imagine my future without him, and I don't want a divorce, but I'm stressed, exhausted, and trying not to cry myself to sleep tonight thinking about it. Update 2 days later. A lot has happened since I last posted, and honestly, I don't know where to begin. I guess I should start by saying that my husband and I are going to couples counseling, and I'm very optimistic about things returning to the way they were before everything started to boil over. I want to take a moment to thank everyone who commented and helped me understand what he and I are going through and how to navigate it. Someone even recommended an episode from a podcast that helped me a lot. I didn't expect this post to get so much attention, but I'm very grateful for everyone who left helpful and insightful advice. That being said, this update is going to be long, so apologies in advance. When I originally posted, the argument that sparked it had happened almost a week prior. Now, it has been a little over a week since that argument. The day after I posted, I decided to look into therapy and counseling for both my husband and me, as well as play therapist for Dawn. Some people suggested that her dysfunction wasn't normal and that she might be going through something, either related or unrelated to my husband's and my behavior. I spent the entire day making a list of what I needed and wanted to bring up during the talk I planned to have with my husband later that day. I was obsessing over what I wanted to say and how to say it, as many of you suggested being gentle with my wording and encouraging honesty and transparency. Dawn was sick and stayed home from school, so I alternated between preparing for the talk and taking care of her while my husband was at work. Around 12:30 p.m., I was getting some medicine for my daughter when my husband called me. I answered, and he asked how my day was going and if there was anything I needed him to do after work or when he got home. I was a little surprised since he hadn't called me during his lunch break in a long time, and I might have been imagining it, but it sounded like he'd been crying because his voice was raspy and quiet. We talked throughout his lunch break. I didn't bring anything up because I wanted to save the actual talk for when we were in person, and eventually, he had to go and hung up. I'll be honest, it made me worried. While he used to call me like this all the time before Dawn was born, it had been a long time, and I was overthinking why he'd call me now. I think Dawn realized I was troubled because of her father. When I came back to her, she asked who I was talking to. When I told her, she asked in a quiet, sad voice if I was upset because Papa was ignoring me too. Now, I'm a very resilient woman, especially when it comes to putting on a brave face for my daughter. But when she said that, I felt so distraught and guilty about how aware she was of the situation and how she viewed her relationship with her father that I started crying, which made her cry too. While we hugged, I reassured her that her father loved her very much and was just having a hard time. She told me she didn't want him to be having a hard time. I took the opportunity to ask her if she was having a hard time. She admitted she was sad because she thought Papa didn't love her and wanted him to be happy again. We cuddled on her bed, and eventually, I fell asleep comforting her. When I woke up, the sun had already set. Dawn was still sleeping, and I could hear my husband watching something in our room. After making sure Dawn was tucked in, I went into our room. When my husband noticed me, he paused the show and asked how I slept. I told him I slept fine and asked how his day was. He said it was fine too. I joined him in bed, and he offered me a pillow for my back before unpausing the TV. It was awkward, there was something he wanted to tell me, and I needed to talk to him, but neither of us knew how to start. At some point, he laid his head on my lap, and I stroked his hair. He put his arm under my legs, and we sat in silence for a while, watching TV. Eventually, I decided we needed to talk, so I paused the TV and asked if we could. He hesitated and tensed up but said sure. I took a deep breath and tried to remember everything I'd written down earlier. I started by saying that I'd noticed him withdrawing and being distant for a few years now. After our argument a week ago, I was really worried. I didn't sugarcoat it. I wasn't hostile or accusatory, but I was clear that Dawn and I were being affected by his behavior and that it couldn't go on. I teared up a little, and at some point, he flipped around on my lap and hugged my stomach as I kept talking. I went on a bit of a rant about how tired I was, how I felt like he wasn't doing enough to help, and how I was worried about him. I brought up some of your points and mentioned that how he was acting toward Dawn was negligent and could set her up for a lifetime of pain if he didn't stop. I didn't feel good saying it, but he needed to understand the gravity of the situation. I could tell he started crying because his breathing hitched, and I felt my shirt get wet where his face was. He was trembling as he held me tighter. My husband is a very emotional man, though he doesn't cry often. Seeing him cry so silently while shaking so hard made me nervous and worried. I practically begged him to talk to me. At first, he clung to me in silence, and I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a choked voice, he said he was so sorry. Sitting up, he explained that he'd never wanted to hurt Dawn or me but that everything had been so hard for him lately that he didn't know what to do and had just started clamming up. I asked him to elaborate, but he got choked up and struggled to speak. I was worried he would shut down, so I admitted I'd posted on here to get advice and suggested he read some of the comments to understand better. He agreed, and I gave him my phone. I rubbed his back as he read. After a while, he gave my phone back. Though he tried to hold it together, it was clear he was barely managing. I told him I wouldn't interrupt and that I wanted him to be honest with me. After that, he completely broke down. He talked for a long time, and his thoughts were all over the place. I'll try my best to explain everything chronologically to avoid confusion. As I mentioned in my original post, my husband and I met years ago when he was visiting my city before moving in with me while we were dating. What I hadn't mentioned is that he's from a different country and migrated to the US about 2 years before we met. He told me that back home, his dad wasn't really there, and he could count on one hand the number of conversations with his dad that lasted more than 10 minutes. His mother was always stressed and didn't seem to like him or his siblings very much. Because he was always sensitive and not interested in the same things as other kids, he had a poor relationship with most of his brothers. The only family member he still talks to is his younger sister, though their relationship is strained for reasons he asked me to keep private. We're very different in many ways. I'm outgoing, outdoorsy, and confident, while he's quiet, nerdy, and a bit insecure. Because of this, our social circles hardly overlap. Recently, a commenter made me realize I regretfully knew little about his group of friends or who he spent time with outside of me. Well, as it turns out, he doesn't have any friends. He told me that, at the beginning, he met two guys at a bar and became friends with them. He had mentioned them briefly early in our relationship, but he didn't talk about them much, and I admit I never asked. He explained that these friends often planted the idea in his head that I was holding him back and that dating an older woman when he was still young would be something he'd regret later, when he was older and undesirable. He defended me and told them to stop talking about me like that. Despite their comments, he kept hanging out with them because they were his only friends, and when they weren't badmouthing me, they were fun to be around. However, after he got a job and we got married, they started contacting him less. When they did meet up again, they brought a female friend and suggested he have fun one last time before tying himself down. This led to a huge fight that nearly became physical until the woman stepped in to separate them. My husband came home that day in a horrible mood. I vaguely remember that day, and when I asked him why he was upset, he claimed he'd gotten into an argument at the grocery store. I didn't believe him even then, but I chose not to press him because he clearly didn't want to talk about it. Since then, he said, he's had an impossible time making new friends. While he's adjusted to the cultural differences in America, he still feels incredibly lonely and isolated. For nearly 16 years, he has tried to fill the void of social interaction through one work friend or by channeling all his time and energy into me. When Dawn was born, he put everything he had into caring for her and me, hardly stopping to relax. He said anytime he paused, the loneliness hit him again, and he was reminded of what he was missing. Through tears, he admitted there were times he was tempted to drink or harm himself just to escape the feelings, but he refrained because he wanted to be strong for us and didn't want to fall into the same patterns of alcoholism that ran in his family. He explained that after dedicating himself entirely to his family for so long, he eventually crashed. He started feeling tired all the time, and when Dawn began acting out, the stress overwhelmed him. He found himself thinking back to what his former friends had said and wondering if this was what they meant. He said he felt ashamed for letting their words influence him and for letting himself resent Dawn and me for everything wrong in his life. At this point, he was trembling and sobbing, apologizing over and over again for his thoughts and behavior. He hugged me so tightly it hurt, and his breathing became erratic. It was clear he was spiraling, so I had to interrupt him, even though I'd promised not to, so he could calm down. At that point, he was stuck in a loop of guilt and regret, apologizing repeatedly. He told me more about the state of his mental health, but it's hard for me to think about without tearing up. I know I shouldn't, but I've been beating myself up for not noticing how much he was struggling. I can't help but feel like I failed as a wife for not recognizing that he was drowning and for not asking him more about his life or his friends. That night, we had the longest, most honest conversation we've ever had in our relationship. By the end of it, we were both crying and holding each other. I reassured him of how much Dawn and I loved him and appreciated everything he'd done for us. I promised to be by his side every step of the way and to help him get the support he needed. It was the first time in a long while that we snuggled so closely, and miraculously, he didn't toss or turn at all that night. I stayed up for as long as I could, kissing his face, rubbing his back and making sure he felt loved, even after he fell asleep. The next day, I asked him to take the day off work so we could focus on each other and make sure nothing was left unsaid. He agreed. We spent the day bowling, eating at a local cafe, visiting an ice cream shop, and then going home to cook dinner together. During dinner, we discussed our next steps. We agreed to start marriage counseling for him to begin individual therapy to address his mental health. Based on everything he's told me, I'm almost certain he's been dealing with depression. Later, we picked Dawn up from school and asked if she wanted to go to the park. She was thrilled. I let my husband take the lead, and I watched as the two of them played on the playground and chased each other in the grass. It was the happiest and most energized I'd seen him in a long time, and it made my heart swell. On the car ride home, he sat in the back seat with Dawn and played I Spy with her. At one point, Dawn said very excitedly, "I'm so happy Papa loves me again." I could practically hear my husband's heart break. He went silent for a long time before hugging her tightly without saying a word. Dawn looked guilty for making him sad, and I think my husband noticed because, when we got home, he quickly excused himself to the bedroom for a moment before coming back out, trying to seem cheerful to lift her spirits. The rest of the day went smoothly. As I was getting ready for bed, I heard him in the next room telling Dawn how much he loved her, that he had never hated her, and that he never wanted her to think otherwise. He read her a bedtime story, and after she fell asleep, he came into our room. We talked for a while, and I told him how proud I was of him for being so open and for all he survived. I kissed him and convinced him to cuddle me again, though it didn't take much convincing. As I write this, I'm lying in bed with him snoring loudly on my chest. I doubt I'll get much sleep tonight, lol. We've planned a weekend getaway this week. Dawn is excited to stay with her cousins, who have a pool she loves. I'm forever grateful to everyone who commented and helped me through this. I can only see our love growing stronger from here. My only regret is not addressing these issues years ago, but I'm focused on repairing and rebuilding our marriage. My husband asked me to thank all of you for your concern and for slapping some sense into him. He even joked about taking our problems to Reddit instead of paying for counseling. This will be my only update unless something extraordinary happens, so thank you for reading and for listening to my story. If you're going through something similar, I strongly encourage you to sit down with your significant other and get to the root of the problem. Trust me, it will do wonders for your relationship. Edit. I forgot to mention that my husband explained why he walked away when Dawn tried to talk to him. He said he was overwhelmed that day, felt like he was going to pass out, and, honestly, she was starting to get on his nerves. He apologized to her and promised never to do it again. Dawn was very understanding and sweet with him, and I'm so proud of them both.